Around 2,300 years ago, Master Sun classified terrain with two different systems. Can these ancient systems help us understand terrain in modern warfare? Hi, I'm John LeMay and welcome to my basement war room. Today I'm going to talk about Sun Tzu on terrain. In The Art of War, Master Sun dedicates almost 3 entire chapters. Chapters 9, which is generally entitled Movement, but discusses such things as how do you move through a swamp. And then chapters 10, the nature of terrain, and chapter 11, the effects of terrain on troops. So, today I'll talk about the nature of terrain, terrain effects on troop, and then although this is a video in the Great Military Philosophers on Afghanistan series, I'm going to take a little trip to Iraq and give an Iraq example today. And then I'll conclude with some references. So let's jump right into it. The nature of terrain. Now, before I get into it, again, I want to mention that there's 2 different classification systems, and I don't quite understand how the authors of On War intended the 2 different ones to be used. Because if you take a look at accessible, well, that is almost the exact same thing here, accessible in chapter 10, as communicating terrain in chapter 11. I'll also note that I use the Griffith translation for the names of terrain because it's short, simple, one words, whereas Ames generally has a phrase for the meaning of the terrain. One possible explanation is, again, that Master Sun didn't write The Art of War. It was written probably over a couple hundred years following his death, and so different sources came together to create these 2 classification systems. But anyway, with that intro, let me jump into it. So accessible is both sides can approach the terrain. Entrapping is you can easily go into it, but it's very difficult to come out. Indecisive is it leads to a standoff or gives the same disadvantages to both sides. Constricted, a narrow pass. Precipitous is an even narrower pass, a defile. And distant can literally mean, hey, we're distant from the terrain, but also means it confers the same advantages to both sides. So that's chapter 10, the nature of terrain. Let's take a look at chapter 11. Okay, here we get into terrain effects on troops. And although some is very similar, for example, as I said, communicating, that is a very important concept, and I'm glad that it was pointed out in ancient times, because it's important to go beyond just recognizing the nature of terrain, which is also important, but really to think through what effect is it going to have on my formations and on the enemy formations. So, effects on troops is important terrain. The first is dispersive, which means you're in your own territory. And that's actually going to be the example I give from Iraq. So we'll come back to that in some detail. Okay, frontier is a small penetration to enemy territory. Key gives either side a marked advantage. Whoever holds that piece of terrain has a marked advantage. Communicating is accessible to both sides. Focal is a vital intersection, and in the Art of War often talked about the intersection of the borders of multiple nation states. Serious is a deep penetration into enemy territory. Difficult has natural obstacles, so it sounds a lot to me like the narrow passage from the previous chapter. Encircled is you're vulnerable to ambush, and death means there's no way out. It's a place where you have to fight to survive. Okay, that is chapter 11, effect of terrain on troops. Now let's take a look at an example from Iraq. Okay, so I'm going to talk about dispersive train. First, let me just read to you what Master Sun and the commentary says about that terrain. When a chieftain is fighting in his own territory, it is dispersive terrain. So that's Master Sun. Then the commentary. So called because the soldiers, being near to their homes and anxious to see their wives and children, are likely to seize opportunity afforded by a battle and scatter in every direction. In their advance, observes Tu Mu, They will lack the valor of desperation, and when they retreat, they will find harbors of refuge. So my first reaction to that concept was, hey, that doesn't apply anymore. I have always thought as home territory giving a morale advantage to a defending force. And that, I mean, thinking about it in context of the Civil War or just in the United States Army, can you imagine if the United States Army were fighting in the United States of America to defend a home territory? There's no chance that people would desert because they're near home. They would be that much more motivated to defend their homeland. However, then I started thinking a little bit more about my experience in Iraq, and what Master Sun said started to make sense. So in Iraq, and this is 2005-6 time frame, there, we were training the Iraqi army, and we're making it in our own image. So we did the national army where we took Kurds and Shia and Sunni from all over Iraq and mixed them together, and then put those units into whatever part of Iraq we needed them. And so we did that, and often soldiers would be going AWOL for 1 to 2 weeks a month, every month, going AWOL, 1 to 2 weeks a month. So, we had all kinds of nasty thoughts about the character. Iraqi soldiers have no character, they're not willing to fight, and or about their training. They're so poorly trained, they're terrible. But what it turned out to be was actually I think, pretty understandable administrative issue. And that issue was they were paid in cash. So their pay would flow down the chain of command, and what, a lot of it was siphoned off by corrupt higher officers and officials, but what actually got to the privates was paid to them by their supervisors in cash. So they were given cash. Now, that, what do you do with that cash? Well, let's think about a soldier stationed in Mosul who is from Baghdad. He's got to get that money back to his family in Baghdad, otherwise they're not going to survive. And so he would leave every month. He got paid every month. Every month he would leave and go on that journey to Baghdad and then come back, and that would take 1 to 2 weeks. And that's a life or death situation. First of all, if any insurgents are able to intercept the soldier during his travels, they're going to kill him. So he's got to really be cautious and use a lot of operational security in getting back to his family. Then when he gets back to his family, just imagine that you are living in the midst of a civil war. And so you're stationed up in Mosul and you're fighting in Mosul, but your family is at real risk back in Baghdad. So of course when he gets back to his family, the soldier's going to want to make sure they're okay, see if there's any issues he's got to take care of, if they're at risk for anything. And then of course he's just going to want to spend some time with them. And so dispersive, the way Sun Tzu describes dispersive train, that it's when you're in your own territory as a scattering effect, was absolutely true in Iraq. And it wasn't because the Iraqis had terrible character or they were poorly trained. It's because they were paid in cash and they had to get that paycheck back to their family in order for their families to survive in a civil war environment. Okay, so that is my example of terrain using Iraq. Okay, I want to give a couple references. The first of it is, of course, The Art of War by Sun Tzu. This is the Giles translation. What I like about this book is it first gives The Art of War pure, and then second gives it with the commentary. And today I read to you from the commentary version. I also use the Griffith translation. So all those train classifications were Griffith because he gives a one-word descriptor of the train. However, primarily I use Ames because Ames's translation is just, for me, a little bit more insightful. Okay, another reference is On Tactics by Friedman. Friedman has a chapter on terrain, and he extensively uses the Art of War in his terrain classification system. And then finally, I want to point out a Facebook group. And that Facebook group is The Art of War, Sun Tzu Ping Fa, Science of Strategic Studies by Hein Drop. And as I was struggling with, hey, why are there two classification systems? How do they work together? I asked the question there and got a great response from Heindrop, and he has provided a lot of valuable commentary throughout this series. So it's a great reference for Sun Tzu. Okay, my mission here in the Basement War Room is to preserve the lessons of Iraq and Afghanistan. If you'd like to join in that purpose, please join the Facebook group Lessons of the Afghanistan and Iraq Wars. If you want to go a little bit more behind the scenes, then sign up for the newsletter at thebasementwarroom.com. Thank you very much for joining me today.